and welcome. I'm Oles Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. The global climate strike has kicked off on Friday and will ripple across the world in more than 4,000 locations. The start of a week-long movement to raise international attention on the climate emergency. Hundreds of thousands of young people in more than 130 countries are joining marches, and Ukraine is joining as well. This is the third worldwide climate rally of such kind. Some are calling it the biggest mass protest in the history of the climate crisis. To talk more about the rally held in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, we welcome to our studio today Iryna Savchuk, Executive Director of the public organization Ekoaction. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Hello.
It is really nice that this movement was started basically by young people, by school children, and let's look at it now. It became global, it became well known, and this issue of global crisis is really gaining momentum and gaining enough attention, I hope, but we will discuss it in this conversation. So today at 12 p.m. This march started in Kyiv. I know that 1,500 people were registered to participate, but tell us a bit more about the march, about the atmosphere of it, and how many people actually came to the march.
We have a feeling that there were much more people, so it's at least 2,000 as we feel it. But of course we have to wait for more official information from police how many people came. The atmosphere was great. There were people which came from many cities, from different cities in Ukraine.
I've heard around 20 cities participated.
Yes, different movements, vegetarian movement, animal protection movement, movements for green areas in the cities. So many different movements joined together because climate change is such a complex issue that basically it touches upon many different sectors. So it's energy, it's transport, it's green areas and forests, it's agriculture, so many sectors,
and food industry,
waste. So all these sectors, they have impact on climate, and there are also issues that they can implement to reduce emissions.
And also we know that 4 more cities, Ukrainian cities, held marches as well today. Tell us about those who participated, because as I mentioned in the first question, the movement was started by kids. So who was participating today?
Globally, these recent climate marches, they're really initiated by kids because they feel that their future is under threat and that the politicians are not doing enough action. So there is a feeling that everybody speaks about climate, but looking at the actions, it's not enough. So that's why it came across all the world, and it's specifically young people because it's their future.
Yes, we remember this Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. Yes,
exactly.
She's 16 years old now, and since last year she's very famous already and a very active person addressing this issue of climate crisis. And yes, she's addressing that we have to build our future, we have to be responsible for our future. So please, continue.
Yeah,
sorry.
But climate movement in Ukraine, it's already more than 20 years old. In 2000, there was a first working group, a network of NGOs who started to work on climate change issues. And all these years, they were trying to influence the policy documents. There were information tours all over Ukraine. We were talking to media, so we were trying to raise the issue. But of course, with Greta Thunberg and all this global movement, this issue became also much more visible in Ukraine. And also people feel much more about climate, that they feel that there are changes. They feel that the weather became much more unpredictable. They see storms, they see extreme weather events. It's all increasing, so there is a direct feeling from people that something is happening and we have to act.
That is true. We have to act. Interesting note is that Greta Thunberg, she created this movement, Fridays for Future, last year in 2018, but the first march took place in Kyiv in 2015, right? So could you please tell us about that? What was the cause for this march to happen? And maybe you could compare the march that was held 3 years ago with 4 years ago, excuse me, and the march that took place today.
Yeah, the first one was in 2015. It was just before the Paris Agreement took place. So there was a negotiation. Was signed. There was negotiation. Every year there are international climate change negotiations under United Nations, and every year civil society asks governments to take actions. And this climate deal, it was very much expected, because before that, in 2009, countries failed to adopt a deal in Copenhagen. So it took another 6 years, and it was still unclear would be a climate deal in Paris or not. So my colleagues who worked on climate, they were very much motivated to do something in Kyiv to actually show this, that this issue is also important for Ukraine. And when they came to us with the idea, we were a bit skeptical how many people can come. Because the issue was not so popular. But in reality, the march did happen, and it joined more than 500 people. And for that time, it was quite a big success. And I'm very happy to see that today it's more than 2,000 people.
Yeah.
And it means
4 times more.
Yeah, 4 times more. And it means that there are more and more people who get concerned. And it gives hope that more and more people will act. And we will do all the necessary steps in all the sectors to reduce emissions.
That is true. Well, let's remind the audience what is Paris Agreement about, that this is a pledge to cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% by 2030 in order to keep the rise of global temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius. But do you see the results from implementing this Paris Agreement?
The problem is that what is planned as an overall goal, that's a very good target. That's what scientists say. We shouldn't overcome 1.5 or 2 degrees warming, but the contributions that countries put on the table, what each country will do for climate, if we count all of that, we are going for the global warming over 3-4 degrees by the end of the century. So we are not on the track. And to get to the track, every country in the world, by the middle of the century, has to phase out all the fossil fuels, coal, gas, oil, and transform its energy and economy to renewable energy sources. At the same time, to implement enormous energy efficiency measures, because we cannot consume energy inefficiently anymore, and of course to do also many other issues in other sectors, to increase forests areas, to have much better management of waste, and have much better public transport and transport systems.
Well, it would be good to start sorting out waste in Ukraine, and Sweden is a good example, and also we would be able to use this waste in the renewable energy, because it's a great also renewable energy source. But since we're talking mainly about Ukraine, and you voiced that, well, there are some efforts taken by the countries to target the climate change, and there should be energy efficiency. We cannot consume as much as we are, or that should be like eco-energy. So have you voiced some demands to the Ukrainian government?
Yeah, we did voice 6 major demands. One is put Ukraine on the track for transition to 100% renewable energy by the middle of the century. Second one is to phase out subsidies to fossil fuel industry. We still have in Ukraine unprofitable coal mines, which each year get subsidies from the state to continue operation, and this issue has to be resolved. We have a demand to provide enough resources from the state budget for energy efficiency measures, so that buildings become much better. And it means that we will care for climate, but also people will reduce the bills, what they pay for heating and for electricity.
Just because they will stop wasting the heat.
Yeah, just because they will use energy more efficiently, exactly. There is a demand to increase measures on industrial farming, because industrial farming also produces a lot of emissions. And it's not only climate emissions, but it's also other emissions. So it has to be regulated stricter. And there are also demands in the waste sector to implement the law for extended producer responsibility, which would enable collection of money and implementing the scheme which would allow waste recycling, because on its own it's not economically, it doesn't work economically. And the last one is regarding transport sector. We demand better and more developed public transport in cities, and we also demand convenient cycling infrastructure, so that people in Ukraine who want to go to work or to school by bike, they can do it and be safe.
But that would require probably a reconstruction of some parts of the city.
It can be different. In big cities like Kyiv, it's more complicated. But there are many smaller cities in Ukraine where it's completely possible, and it means that the city has to develop the strategy, and when they reconstruct streets, they already take it into account.
And if they build some new areas, new districts of city, they have to take these into account, of course. Well, you talked first about energy efficiency, and now I think we do know that energy efficiency is one of the top priorities for Ukraine, and energy independence from Russia. And Ukraine has just gotten new president, new parliament, new government. So I'm curious, have you started a dialogue with the new powers?
There is a dialogue with new parliamentarians. They are open to listen, and there are planned meetings. So we hope for this interactive dialogue and for the necessary laws to be adopted. On the level of the government, it's still in the process. So the Ministry of Energy is united with Ministry of Environmental Protection, and it's still unclear who is doing what and how it will proceed. But
so they need to distinguish the responsibilities.
Yeah, but the new minister, he comes from the Renewable Energy Association, so we hope that his policy and his positions would be much more balanced in terms of development of renewable energy sources than...
How passionate are the new MPs about the climate change?
I hope they are passionate, and I hope they have heard the climate march today, and they will be engaged in these processes.
Well, I mentioned that people all over the world are walking out today of their schools, of their workplaces, to demand action and to address this climate change. And a good example was New York for me today, because 1.1 million students were allowed to skip classes and participate, of course, with their parents' permission. This was reported and allowed by the Department of Education. I want to project it onto Ukraine and ask you, does Ukrainian Ministry of Education somehow participates in the rally like this?
That's a great example from New York. We didn't have this idea, so we have never asked the Ministry of Education to produce something like that or make a statement.
So in Ukraine, more students?
Yeah, it was mainly students, because even when we were organizing and calling people to come, of course, it's a responsibility to call kids, and they have to come with parents. So yes, but for the future, I think it's a great idea, and for the next climate marches, we will do the same, and that could bring much more people and much more awareness, because people learn in schools something, but it's somewhere else. When they see it on the street, when they see it in the real life, it's a completely different feeling, and being in the march is a very good feeling when you're part of the society which demands the change, and all of them are very nice people who do their action in their own area or in their own city.
And also it is much easier to absorb a new idea when you're in school than when you're adult. Thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for bringing this issue of climate change to this great spotlight. Thank you for being a guest today in our studio.
Thank you.
That was Iryna Savchuk, Executive Director of the public organization Ekoaction. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more with UATV.